Okay everyone, this is the second part of my fan test and I've got a lot of stuff in front of me, so I'm going to show you what each thing is and why it's important for this test. What I'm going to do today is a noise test, so I want to do this away from an actual computer. You can see my computer's off behind me, there's nothing on in here that's making a noise other than the fan that I'm going to test. And my test setup is a PSU on its own. This is just an old PSU from an old rig I don't use anymore. And I've attached that to a jumper switch. So this is actually a jumper cable which is attached to the PSU. So I can just switch it on and off. I have a fan controller here on the bench, and what this will allow me to do is change the fan RPM using the touchscreen. And this is the same fan controller I used in the first test, it was just in the PC. What I'll be able to do is use the touchscreen. In fact, if I turn it on, I can show you. This fan controller here, it's got an LCD touchscreen that allows you to change the RPM. Now this is the outside of the fan, it's electric going through this, so I don't want to touch it too much, but it will allow me to adjust the speed of the various fans. I have all the fans I'm testing. This time I'm not testing the fan that came with the GPU because I can't attach it to this fan controller. It's got a bespoke 3-pin connector. Probably could do it with a bit of wiring, but I'm not that interested in doing it because I want to decide on the fan for my new build. So again, I've got the Aigo fan, the Aerocool fan, the Sharktoon fan, the Parvum fan and the Corsair SP1. I went through the fans I'm using in the first video. I also have a phone here, and that's because I'm going to use a smartphone app which allows monitoring decibel levels. Now, the app itself probably isn't too accurate, but for what I'm doing, that doesn't really matter. Getting an accurate reading on exact decibels doesn't really matter because I can still see if something is louder than another. So if the number that comes up is a higher number for one fan than another, I know that fan's louder, even if those numbers aren't particularly accurate. The way I'm going to do these tests is I'm going to plug the fans into the fan controller and run them at the same RPMs I did in the first test. The lowest possible RPM, the highest possible RPM, and then for a middle ground that I can do a like-for-like observation of all fans, I'm going to run them at 700 RPM. And the way I'm going to do that is, first of all, I'm going to take the fan that I want to test, place it next to the radiator, and this radiator comes in a moment. Place it next to the radiator, place the phone with its microphone facing the fan, and then read the level. I'll do that for each speed, so the slowest fan setting, in fact the fan should be that way around, blowing into the radiator, so I'll make sure I do that right in the test. So the fan will be blowing onto the phone. I'll measure the volume at minimum RPM, maximum RPM and 700 RPM. As before, this fan does not actually have a PWM controller, so for this fan I'm going to be using minimum RPM and maximum RPM set by the controller, which is on here, and it only has 2 speeds, so I'll be testing both. Once I've done that, I thought it would be interesting to see if the radiator had any difference, or made any difference to the noise. So I'm also going to attach the fan to the radiator I'm going to be using, and that's this one here. This is what I'm going to be using when you build an XSPC RX360. I'm actually going to be using this fan in the build, and what I'm going to do is attach the fans in a push configuration, or one of the fans I'm testing, in a push configuration, run the fan at each for 3 RPMs, or 2 RPMs in this fan's case, and put the phone here on the ground and see if it makes any difference to the noise. I expect the noise to be slightly different because the blades or fins in the radiator will disrupt the airflow somehow. Whether it will make it louder or quieter is an interesting question, but we'll find out. Okay, on with the test. I'm going to do the test in the same order as before. I'm going to do, or try and do it in the same order, I'm going to do the Corsair, the Sharktoon, the Parvum, the Aerocool, and finally, because it's not PWM, the Aigo. Okay, let's get on with it. Okay, I've got the first test setup running. I've got the fan positioned at the radiator's depth away from the phone. I'm just using the radiator here as a measure. so I can get the distance consistent between the two and have the same distance when it comes to doing the test with the fan on the radiator. It's running at 700 RPM and it's showing as 29 decibels or thereabout. It jumps around slightly because the fan noise is obviously not consistent. Let's up the fan speed. That's now running at 1400 RPM, just wait for the fan to speed up. And with that running at 1400 RPM, it's now showing at about 51. Again, it jumps around between a couple of decibels, but roughly 51 decibels. And that's interesting, that's a lot louder. I can audibly hear that now, while I couldn't previously. So it's a lot louder at its full RPM, and that's not surprising at all. I'm going to do this same test again for each of the fans, but before I do that I'm going to test this one on the radiator just to see if there is actually a difference. Okay, I've attached the fan to the radiator, you can see it there working and spinning. It's running at 700 RPM at the moment. I'm going to put that, same way I did the test before, I'm going to put the radiator here, the fan's on the radiator, and the smartphone is going to be touching the radiator to read our value. So the distance is the same, the fan speed is the same, the only difference is there's a radiator between the fan and the decibel meter. Now I'm going to be quiet for a second and see if that's actually made a difference to the volume. And the answer is no, it's showing as 29 to 30 decibels again. Nothing has changed there by adding the radiator in between the fan and the decibel meter. Let's turn the fan up now to 1400 and see if it's actually made any difference at all. Okay, so this is interesting. At 1400 RPM, the decibel meter is showing 47, so that's slightly quieter going through the radiator. Now it could be that some of the air is getting blocked by the fins in the radiator, and that's what I thought might happen. So they're actually restricting the airflow, so not as much air or moving air is hitting the decibel meter, and it's displaying the same value. Now there wasn't much change at low RPM, and this probably scales in a non-linear way. The faster the RPM, the more restriction the radiator gives. At lower RPM there's enough space in the radiator between the fins for all of that air, or almost all of that air, to actually get through to the decibel meter. With the higher RPM there's going to be more air fighting its way through those fins, and not as much is going to come out the other side without being slowed down. So that actually makes sense in real terms. So I'm going to do the same test now with all the fans and see what happens. Okay, the results are in, and living up to its name, the Corsair SP120 Quiet Edition was, across the board, the quietest fan. At both low RPM and high RPM, it performed the best in the noise test with the decibel meter. I'll come on to a caveat with that in a moment, but the 700 RPM results were all pretty much consistent. Every fan was roughly 30 decibels, regardless of which of the 5 fans you used. They were between 29 and 30 decibels. The Corsair was consistently 29, these jumped up occasionally to 31, but they were all within margin of error. And regardless of what I was doing, the decibel meter would jump around between different points. And I think that's important because subjectively, I actually found the Parvum fan to be louder than the Sharktoon, even though they both registered 30 decibels at 700 RPM. This fan seemed a lot quieter than this one, and I think that's to do with the way the noise is produced. There was a slightly audible clicking noise in this fan each time the fan rotated. Now it might be because it's an older fan, it's not brand new, and this one is, or it might be something else. But audibly this was louder than this, even though the decibel meter was displaying the same value. There may also be a question of pitch. Maybe the pitch this fan produces just sounds louder, like higher pitched things often seem louder than lower pitched things, than the pitch produced by this Sharktoon fan. And this Sharktoon fan was actually the second quietest after the Corsair. So this was actually very good for an £8 fan. This did very well. Of course, as we know in the performance test, it didn't perform as well as the static pressure Corsair fan did. So at higher RPM, what I found was, as you'd expect, as you increase the RPM, the noise goes up. We already knew that, but they all performed pretty much as you would expect. The higher end fans, the more expensive fans, had a lower decibel at high RPM than the cheaper fans. There's an image on the screen. I haven't yet mentioned the Aigo fan, because this is a slightly different beast. It doesn't have a PWM fan controller. It's got its own one with two settings, high and low. And what this got was, at a low setting, it scored 41, which is actually 11 decibels higher than the Corsair. But again, subjectively, it didn't seem much louder unless you put your ear right next to it. So there could be something else at play than just pure decibel levels. At high RPM it scored 60, which is about in line with the Corsair. Again, I don't know what RPM each setting runs at, but I did find it was more consistent. So although the Parvum had that clicking noise and the Aerocool seemed louder, I would say that the Aigo actually seemed quieter than either of them, even though the decibel meter was reading 41 versus 30. What that means, I don't know. But for me, for my build, I'm either going to use the Corsair SP120, which would go quite nicely with the black and white radiator, or I'm going to go full out RGB and go for the Aigo fan. Because even though it registered as louder, it performed well in the tests for performance, and it didn't subjectively seem as loud. So I'm just going to throw the results in the face and possibly go with this fan because it looks cool. That's it for now. In my next video, I'm going to show you the basis of my Threadripper build. I'm going to get some more of these fans, whichever ones I eventually go with, and start planning out the radiator placement and the fan design and the way the whole case is going to look. So give me a like, give me some comments, give me some feedback, subscribe if you want to see any more, and thank you for watching. I will see you next time.